We just saw a very interesting one that only 3 out of over 54 countries, 55 maybe, are releasing documents or maybe enough information on their budgeting information. So what's the worst case scenario that could happen here, given that most don't even release any data at all?
Well, I think the reality is that when information is not available, then there is no mechanisms to actually validate whether the money that is put in the budget actually does translate into real money that goes down to be spent, and whether it actually reaches the people that is meant to benefit. So the absence of data is critical because it doesn't allow ordinary citizens or even watchdog organizations to hold governments accountable for the promises they make and for the budgets that they publish, if they publish them at all.
Now, if we're looking at that being done with governments now releasing, maybe making their financial year budgets, but they don't release any data, and we're looking at maybe bridging the gap between the poverty gap, how do we even go about it if we don't have enough data on which we can base most of the decisions that are made and helping lift the citizens out of poverty? How is this even done?
I believe that a lot of civil society organizations, including One Campaign, the Open Government Partnership, UNECA, and Transparency International are all partnering together to encourage governments to enter into this compact where they make not only their budgetary information available, but also they institute mechanisms for open contracting, so that not only is the total budget available and allocation, but how it is being spent. And also that it is being spent in a manner that gives value for money, for the money that is being spent from the government coffers. There are governments that are now beginning to centralize treasury systems so that all payments are coming out from a system that can track that government is spending on this and on that. But the other end is we need to enable governments to actually connect with their citizens. And we need to encourage citizens to become active. I was at a memorial of the former Winnie Mandela. And the bishop who spoke there said something that was very noteworthy. He said, accountable governments are a product of active citizens. So there are two ends. Governments will not, without the demand for transparency, will not give transparency. So we need to work with citizens to make sure that they organize, to begin to demand that governments are more transparent. And also we need to work with governments to commit to becoming more transparent.
Now, Rudo, we would need definitely to get into, that is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now. But if we're talking $1 trillion being siphoned out of sub-Saharan African nations each, not on a general perspective, how now do we go about it with recommendations? What would you recommend to better now go about it? Because this is a lot of money going out. We don't even have that much for our own budgets. So if this is what's going out now, how do we go about this?
I think what you're referring to is illicit financial flows that are coming out of Africa and going and being lodged in banks, or even finding themselves into tax havens and all such mechanisms. So we have to work on both ends. We have to work with governments in Africa, but we also have to work with governments where these banks are hosted, so that they put in mechanisms to ensure that they do not receive money that would otherwise be invested in the development of Africa.
All right, now let's talk about aid, which you by first sounded so keen about. Now, we do see developing countries as well as taxpayers in donor countries, they are in need of reliable and comprehensive information about the aid inflows. But this has not been a case for poor countries, or not even given enough information about it. What's the case here?
I believe there are many factors. Data, which we made reference to, is critical, both in terms of what is being given as aid. And data has to be desegregated to say, when we say aid? Is it money that actually leaves donor capitals and arrives in recipient government coffers? Or is it money that is designated, but some of it is spent locally? There is now a fudging of the definition of what is aid. There are some governments that are now choosing to define as aid money that they spend on dealing with refugees that have arrived, say, from sub-Saharan Africa in their countries. They want to put it in this global budget called aid. Now, we need to understand exactly what is reaching the countries, what is it meant for, is it being spent in the way that it is meant to be spent, and is it reaching the last mile where it's meant to reach. So there are many, many accountability levels that we need to have, both in the donor capitals and in our own capitals where we live. But the reality is that aid alone is not enough.
All right.
Money must continue to be given to tackle some of the most intractable problems, HIV, AIDS, and other diseases that are preventable. Development programs, health, education, agriculture will continue to need aid. But African countries are in a position much more now than before to also be able to be clear how much they are investing in some of these social sectors. And indeed, they have made commitments way back in Maputo, 2002, in Malabo, in Abuja, to invest certain percentages of their budget. Education, 20%. Agriculture, 10%. Health, 15%. But very few of the African governments are spending even half of the percentage they committed to spend. Why is that? And when they do spend, what is it spent on? Is it all going towards maybe paying the civil service? Or is it actually going towards infrastructure that is necessary? So there are so many layers of data and information that needs to be available. And also, we need to create an environment where citizens have an awareness of those governments and what they are doing, those who are doing well. We also need an appreciation on the part of civil society and citizens. But it takes information on what is being done, what is being spent, what is available, before people can engage meaningfully.
Definitely. Have you been able to find cases where governments now are receiving funds or aid but have not really used it to the last mile, as you mentioned in the first response?
Oh, that is rampant. I think you yourselves were talking about a situation where global fund resources are being withdrawn. It's because the mechanisms that have been put in place to ensure that money is spent for what it is designed to do are not always meeting those needs. I mean, there are many countries. There are questions around Mozambique and the debt and how they're using money that they took as loans. There is questions about how they've used global fund resources. There are many, many countries. And I think mechanisms that have now been put in place bring together not only governments, but also civil society. The country coordinating mechanisms has to be empowered to really monitor what is coming in and whether it's being spent for what it's meant to. So all those mechanisms are supposed to work together, but the end is civil society and governments need to be in a dialogue, a meaningful dialogue that is facilitated by availing data.